Hey everyone, I'm here with Michaela O'Donnell and Lisa Slayton. Michaela is Executive Director of Fuller Seminary's Dupree Center for Leadership, and Lisa is the CEO of leadership consulting firm Tamim Partners, and both are the co-authors of Life in Flux, Navigational Skills to Guide and Ground You in an Ever-Changing World. Hi Michaela, hi Lisa, how are you guys doing?
Hey Marcus, good to be with you.
Yeah, I'm
Good
so
to see
glad.
you, Marcus.
Yes, I'm so glad to have both of you guys here. I would love for you to just share briefly what you do. Michaela, why don't you go ahead and first?
Yeah, thank you. It's again, and I love the podcast and love the work that you guys are doing, and including the larger Church Leadership Institute work. So thanks for doing that. So I am the executive director of the Max Dupree Center for Leadership. We entrusted to our care is sort of a unique mission in a seminary context, in that we get up every day and think about folks in the pews, leaders across industries and seasons of life. And really, the goal is to leverage all the resources of a seminary toward like really practical needs.
Yeah.
So we do everything from run cohorts. We just ran our 85th cohort, a lot of them having to do with professional transition this last year. We do research. We send out a daily devotion. We just all sorts of resources, all aimed at helping leaders across industries and seasons of life sort of cultivate that kind of deep inner work that helps them lead, especially when things are tough.
Yeah, that's great. And you did mention it briefly, but let me just say it again. This podcast is part of the Church Leadership Institute, which is part of the Dupree Center for Leadership, of which you are the leader. So thank you for leading us.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Lisa, and tell us briefly what you do.
Yeah. So for the last 5 years, I have run my own consulting and coaching practice. I really focus in on what in some circles is called vocational stewardship or vocational discipleship. How do I work with people who are in significant seasons of transition, who often come to me with the question, what should I do next? And my answer to them is, well, let's start with who you are. And so doing that deeper inner work of understanding who they are in light of who God is, and then helping them to navigate through the change from a much healthier, non-anxious kind of place. That often translates then into work with teams and organizations, because if I'm working with particularly with a leader, they often say, okay, now that I'm clear and in my lane, come help my team. And so I have a long history of doing that. Prior to starting Tamim in 2019, I was with an organization called the Pittsburgh Leadership Foundation for about 15 years. And similarly, I ran deep dive intensive cohort programs. We started doing them with entrepreneurs and business leaders, and then we developed pastoral versions. We did urban ministry versions. And these were typically 6 to 9 month experiences for people wanting to do this deeper work and have a community of people to do it with. And I think those are that's one of the high values of a cohort experience like the ones that Dupree runs.
Yeah. That's great. And let me just say that both of you have been on Spiritual Life and Leadership in the past. Michaela, you were on maybe 3 years ago or 2.5 years ago, something like that, on episode 114. And I'd love for people to go listen to it. It's called Meaningful Work. And we talk about your previous book, which was titled Make Work Matter. Right? Is that right?
Good job. I'm impressed. That's hard to pull up. Yeah.
And then Lisa was one of my early guests way back in the first year of this podcast. So that would have been back in 2019, and episode 48 titled Integrity and Coherence in Leadership, which is a really fancy sounding title, but it's what we talked about. And so it was good. So anyway, I'd love for folks to go check that out. All right. Let's talk about your book, Life in Flux. And I would love for you just to kind of set the stage and just kind of describe what's the problem that your book is addressing. And Michaela, why don't you go ahead and start? And I'll take turns in terms of maybe who goes first in the questions. Yeah.
Sounds good. And Lisa and I are totally good at jumping in and
for sure.
deferring to each other and all the things as well. And in that, you get a little glimpse of what it was like to write this book as co-authors. Yeah, I mean, some of it is what Lisa and I have already said, just that, the world is, and this is a lot of the work of CLI, the world is moving fast. Change is speeding up, and human brains haven't necessarily changed in order to be able to cope with all that's happening. And we just respectively see a lot of disruption, a lot of, oh my goodness, what, Lisa's question, what should I do? And it's on every altitude level, whether it's kind of the 30,000-foot global level, all the way down to something very personal that's happening in someone's life. And in our own ways, we got to these questions and have been working with folks for a while, and started to feel like we just wanted to put some of that down on paper. And our collaboration is unique. I called Lisa at one point. Actually, this is worth saying. I was slated to write this book. Knew I was going to write a book on transitions. Knew it was going to be called Life in Flux. And I was like, who do I trust the most on this topic? Who do I think does really good work here, that with like real people? And Lisa was my first call. And so we talked a bunch about her work with leaders, sort of really in the trenches and the very hard spots. And so we got together to do that. So whether it's you're in a very hard spot in the trenches, whether you're feeling the effects of change on the 30,000-foot level, whether you're just able to acknowledge and say, yeah, it's all speeding up. This book is a tool and kind of a guidebook to be able to do the inner work that comes up in all those moments, all that counterintuitive, like, ooh, there's my stuff. And, ooh, I just reacted on someone. And, ooh, I don't really feel clear because I've been following everybody else's life plans for me. So it's for all those reasons that we wrote.
That's great. Lisa, anything you would add to that?
I think Michaela's nailed it. I think people are in a place where they don't know what to do when change comes at them. And there are changes that we certainly initiate for ourselves, but oftentimes it's external circumstances, right? That a job change, you buy a new house, you move to a new city, could be the loss of someone important to you. And how we learn to navigate through that is the deeper inner work. And we've been trained culturally to react to things and then just put our head down and keep moving on. And what I've discovered and what Michaela's discovered through her work at Dupree is that that's not sufficient. It doesn't get us to healthy places. It doesn't get us to healthy places physically, emotionally, or spiritually. And yet that's the default, right? Yeah. And so how do we begin to counter the default and create a new posture, as we use the language of common and uncommon posture throughout the book. What are the uncommon postures and what are the shifts we need to make to support ourselves and the other people around us who are impacted by how we move in the world?
Yeah. One of the reasons I loved this book is, and felt connected to it in a sense, was so Church Leadership Institute focuses on adaptive leadership and helping leaders develop adaptive capacity. And really that's what this book is about, is in your individual life, how do you develop adaptive capacity so that you can navigate through this world that keeps changing every week? Like, wait, where was the last week's world? So the first thing that you say to do, you kind of give some skills throughout the book, navigational skills. And the first one you mentioned is to wake up. And I'd love for you to talk about what that means. Lisa, why don't you start with that?
Sure. Well, in my experience, and this has played out over and over again, there are two primary catalysts for waking up. One is possibility. You see something out there that's possible, that has potential, but you're not quite sure how to get there. I would say more commonly, however, the catalyst is some kind of pain, some kind of disruption, some kind of loss that says, I'm out of my depth in how I can handle this. What I've done in the past doesn't work, isn't working. And I share a little bit of my own story in there of kind of having my own waking. I've had many waking up moments, but there was one about 15 years ago that was pretty tough. And I realized all the time, and I do this work, right? And I have all these tools in my toolbox. And what I'm finding is I don't have sufficient tools for this moment. And so it was, I want to navigate this pain. I don't want to walk away from it. I want to learn and grow. And I know I'm out of my own depth. So how do I begin to take the steps towards letting go of some things and learning some new things?
That's great.
Yeah, I think I'd add to that, and this is sort of a tie-in with the adaptive frameworks again, is that waking up sounds a lot like what got me here isn't going to get me to where I want to go
That's
next.
right.
And the moment that you say that, the moment that you feel it, the moment that kind of quietly creeps in, you're in adaptive work, right? Because you've got to sort of get to an unknown future and make your way there. And in my experience, there's a lot of folks who bypass the invitation to wake up, and it's kind of like, that seems that seems hard. Don't want to do that. Been keeping that stuff nicely under the rug for a long time. If I do this is going to have repercussions in my organization, my church, my business, whatever it is. But there's something really sacred that happens when we acknowledge, like Lisa said, we're out of our depth, or, oh goodness, could this be a moment where a different way played out, and that different way actually is helpful?
Yeah. It's like the oh shoot moment, right? Oh shoot. Wait a minute. What, this isn't working, or this, what now? Yeah. And it's almost like without that moment, I mean, you keep going, right? Now, we all have those moments. I mean, that's human life. We have those moments. And I appreciate you saying we could try to ignore them, or bury them, or pretend like they're not there. Hopefully we acknowledge them. And then so we're not going to go necessarily through every single step, but the next thing I think you said was to pause and cut the engine, which I thought was great. And you kind of use this metaphor throughout of a ship lost in the fog, which was a true story, it sounds like. But what does that mean to pause and cut the engine once we have that wake up moment? Yeah.
The story, so I'm actually in the place where the story happened, right, which is fun. My husband grew up going to this little location on the New England coast, and grew up around boats. And he was in high school. I'll date him when I say this, but it was the late 1960s, right? So not recently, obviously. And he's out on a boat with a couple of his buddies on a beautiful day, and they're out. The activity is to go from island to island and play around and, hike on the islands and whatever. And they're trying to make their way back in. And suddenly the beautiful day is just completely socked in with fog. That's a New England term. We're socked in. The fog is keeping us from movement. And the kind of fog that you can't see your hand in front of you, right? It's dense, it's thick, and it's disorienting completely. Like am I upside down? Am I right side up? And his move was counterintuitive. The impulse is to just put the engine in gear and go, but you don't know where you're going, right? And the tools that you have available to you in that time period, anyway, there was no GPS, there's no cell phone, there's none of that. Were paper charts that helped you to read the location and where the rocks were and all the channels and all the things. And of course, if you can't see, a paper chart isn't useful in the slightest. But the thing that is useful up here is that there are sounds to pay attention to. There are foghorns, there are bell buoys, and they all have distinct tones. And if you've been on the water up here long enough, you begin to recognize the sounds and and identify them with their exact location. And that's what Roger did. Well, the only way you can do that is to cut the engine and stop and just sit still in the water and listen. And he had his two friends with him, and he asked them to listen. And then they go, okay, what do you hear? Which direction should we go in? And they start the engine to move again. And they repeated this. And, as the story goes, they finally make their way close to shore. But even then it was too rocky to land right away. And it took them a little bit longer. But now they had some orientation. They had some sense of where they were. It's a counterintuitive move, right? You're lost in the fog. You're out on an ocean in a 17-foot boat. You can't see anything around you, and you cut your engine, really?
Yeah, right.
But that's the move. And so we don't do that naturally. And the external pressures to keep going. We talk about this in the Check Your Speed chapter. The external pressure to keep going and just keep white knuckling through is often the wrong move, but it's the one we know, and it's the one we're comfortable with. So how do we shift to that place of stepping back and pausing and listening and paying attention to what's going around us, and take our cues from that posture to make the next move, rather than from a reactive, got to keep going, got to put my head down posture.
Yeah. So what are we listening for in life, and like in whatever life, whatever we're experiencing, what are we trying to pay attention to?
That's a great question. I think, one of the things that's so powerful about the Rogers story and why it's become the grounding metaphor for this book is just, we all know what it feels like to feel like we're in the fog and we don't really know which way to go. And, Lisa, one of the things I don't love, but I love because it makes an interesting point about the story is that Roger didn't even have his compass with him on the boat.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you start to ask, like, well, how do you orient to where you need to go if you don't have the tools that they tell you need to go?
Mm-hmm.
And that's when you get back to the adaptive work here. It's like, well, what does it mean to have an internal navigational system? In Roger's case, quite literally, he's listening for the sounds of home. It's a pretty powerful metaphor to bring over, though. Like in moments where we're not sure what to do or everything feels messy, what are the sounds metaphorically, sometimes the faces, the places, the mantras of the people who have actually grounded us the most, who know us, who love us without anything that we do or anything that we've, said. And in a way, we're listening for those deepest sounds of belonging. And as Christians, we believe that our very deepest sense of belonging is in God, right? This is a calling, a vocation, a belonging thing. Sometimes it's more abstract to say, how do I listen to sounds of belonging in God when I don't know what to do? That's why I love to say, picture the constellation of the people who, as our friend Patrick Reyes would say, loved you into being. And those can be all different kinds of people. So you're quite literally listening for and moving forward incrementally toward that which, and it's worth saying here too, this is not a return backwards. This is not like, well, let me get back to the things I know, and that's where the safety is going to be. It's actually, in order for Roger to get home, he had to press deeper into the fog, but he had to have an internal sense of, even as I go into this fog, I know what I carry with me. I know who I am. I know what guides me, and I know what I'm listening for. Right?
Yeah. One of the thoughts I had, and I appreciate you bringing up the importance of, God's role in all of this, and trusting God and knowing who we are as God's beloved. And one of the thoughts I had was that, this book could have been written from a very secular perspective. Like you could have given all kinds of skills and principles without including the role of God and Jesus and belonging to God. Why? What's the benefit? Well, how do I want to ask that question? Why do we need Jesus to help us navigate this flux? What's the? Well, let me just ask it that way. Why do we need Jesus in this?
Well, there are lots of answers to that question. I think the big one is there are moments in the space of not knowing where it's certainly hard to trust other people, and it's sometimes even hard to trust ourselves. And there's work to be done in that space to learn to trust ourselves. But I don't think we can trust ourselves apart from first trusting and knowing Jesus. I think, giving ourselves over to a life of following after Jesus and wanting to imitate his way of being in the world is really at the heart of this. And that's really what I think we want people to see, is that's what it means to belong to Jesus, that even in the fog, he can be trusted. Yeah. And we don't have to white knuckle it. We don't have to, hang on by our fingertips, which many of us, I'll speak for myself, are very, very good at, right? Yeah. Just go on your own strength and you can get there. And I think Jesus offers us something better, something calmer, something more settled, that produces flourishing in the long run. And that's at the heart of the work, is learning to know that I do belong to him and that he can be trusted. He's with me in every step.
Yeah.
I think I just briefly would add to that, it's, if we're doing everything ourselves, like we get to be the hero of the story when everything works out. But for all the times when things don't work out, which is increasing in the world that we live in, it's very lonely, right? It's
Yeah.
very lonely to have all that fall, and
Yeah.
just the deep sense that we're not alone in
Yeah.
this, and that God's got us. And I
Mm.
think it's other people too. And I think God shows up in the form of other people quite a bit. But I just imagine a life trying to navigate any part of life without God, and it feels very lonely.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that you said in the book, and I jotted down the phrase, you said something like, we're called to, and the words were be belongers. And I liked that. Yeah. I mean, right. Belonging to Jesus. We belong to Jesus. We belong to God. And at our core, that's what we're called to be, right? Because that's what we are. That's what we are. And I'll just, affirm, I mean, I have found my relationship with Jesus to be the grounding thing that got me through some very fluxy times in my life, and I have often thought, what would I do if I didn't have Jesus to hold on to? And just to say, okay, Lord, I did what I could. Now you do what you can, right? I give this to you now. I did this part, and now you do this part. So I was sharing with you before we hit record, as one of the things I was thinking about as I was reading this is my own life. Because I was like, oh yeah, I went through that. I went through that. I went through that. I'm still going through this, and so, so I thought maybe I would share a little bit of my story in terms of the flux that I've experienced, and the way that I kind of saw some of the things that you describe. I'm like, okay, good. I think I did that part. I think I did. I was like, as I was reading, I'm like, yes, yes, yes. So, just real quickly, 8 or 9 years ago, got accused of some things falsely in my church, led to a year of investigations in my church, and was exonerated, but stirred up enough doubt in the congregation that I got voted out of that church by a margin of 2 votes. And so that was actually, the moment of waking up was when those accusations came, and I was like, wait, what's happening? Why? Like, why is this happening? Right. And then it was a year of cutting the engine, and lots of therapy, lots of psalms of lament, and lots of confusion, right, during that first year. It was after that, after I got voted out, that was actually kind of a clarifying moment. And I was like, okay, but so it was, how did I say that? It was a relief, I should say, because it had been a really hard year. But then I was like, now what? I don't want to be a pastor anymore, right? And so, my entire identity was wrapped up in being a pastor, right? And so now what do I do? That's when Jeff Shue, who's a mutual friend, came along and said, hey, you want to work with me at Flourish San Diego? And I was like, yeah, that sounds great. Do I have to be in charge of anything? No. Good. I don't want to be in charge of anything. Right. But was still able to use some of my gifts and skills working with pastors, right? And doing some speaking and that kind of thing. And that lasted for about 2 years, and it was exactly where I needed to be. It was like one of these little that was an experience of sort of cutting the engine and just paying attention. I didn't realize that's what I was doing, but I was kind of getting a sense of, okay, where am I? Is this forever? For a while, I thought maybe I'd be there, till I retire. Maybe it would be a really great place. And it was a great place for the 2 years that I was there. 2 years later, felt like it was time to move on. Ended up going to a church. So I'd been doing a lot of guest preaching. Guest preaching, by the way, was fantastic because you can show up, you can give your sermon, and you can get out of there. And who cares what anybody thinks, So I did a lot of guest preaching, and some of it was at a church about 2 hours east of San Diego, little tiny rural community in the Imperial Valley, kind of between the Salton Sea and Mexico. And it was wonderful. So I became their interim pastor. I was there on Sundays and Mondays, and I would drive out Sunday morning, stay overnight, come home Monday night, and then I was home the rest of the week. And that was just enough for me, right? In that season. And they were good people. And they gave me some hope again that, oh, okay, maybe churches can be good, right? That was my fear, was like, there's no good churches based on what I had experienced. And so that was sort of like, again, pausing and listening and tiptoeing a little bit. And then after I was there for probably about 4 years, I got an invitation to apply at Mount Soledad Presbyterian Church, which was a risk. It was like another step. So when I was in Westmoreland, right, the rural church, there were mountains between us. Well, I had clear boundaries. If something happened during the week, I'm like, well, I hope you guys can take care of it because I'm far away. Now coming closer, I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to maintain my own boundaries, and maybe I can be a pastor close by again. It's still part-time. It's still interim. I like that. I'm not I'm not fully in yet, but now we're getting to a point where I'm like, I feel like maybe I could be this church's pastor, for at least the next season, their new installed pastor. Right. It's this, it has been and continues to be this very fluxy experience, like trying to figure out, okay, what's next? And doing this podcast was an experiment. And it led to coming on with Church Leadership Institute, which has been a wonderful gift, and I love it. And so all these things, and wrestling with, am I called to be the pastor of a single church? Am I called to help churches in general? Maybe it's both. Multiple churches through the podcast and through other kinds of work that I do. And so that's my case study. And I'd be curious to kind of hear your reflections, because what I know is I'm not the only one who goes through that kind of stuff, right? And so I'd be curious your reflections or even your questions to kind of see, like, okay, how do we navigate these kinds of things? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I would say I'm saddened by your experience in the church, and I'm sorry that happened. It's brutal, and it makes you question everything, right, about yourself, what you believe, all the things you've committed to, and it really plunges you into deep fog, maybe even fog in the dark. We didn't take our analogy that far.
Fog is the right word.
but it's very disorienting, and so I'm sorry. And I give you a ton of credit for slowly stepping your way back in. I learned a phrase during the pandemic when I was studying some things around complexity science, and I'm not sure where it comes from, but I liked it because I think it describes what you did. And it's exploring what this particular researcher called the adjacent possible. So how do you find the thing that you could take a step back to that gives you adjacency to what you've done in the past, but you're not diving right back into it again and setting yourself up for more pain. And the 2 years with Jeff Shue and working with, Fleur San Diego and other pastors, that's an adjacent possible. Being an interim pastor at a church where there was physical distance, that's an adjacent possible. And it gave you confidence and courage to continue to move forward. And you still don't completely know if, what the long-term thing is here, but you're just taking the next steps. And that's really the work is what's the next step I should take? Not I have to architect the 5-year plan. And so I would just encourage you to keep going and keep paying attention. I think you're on a journey. I heard language that I've adopted. I work with a fair amount of young people who are navigating, early stage vocation, and they're all worried about their career ladder. And I said, what? I'm not sure I believe in a career ladder anymore. I like the idea of a career portfolio, right? And it conjures up a different image, but that's what you've created, Marcus, is this career portfolio, vocational portfolio that has lots of pieces to it that can be pulled out in different environments that make you very, very, desirable, if that's the right word to use, for potentially very different kinds of assignments. And I think that gives you flexibility. Some people can't live in that kind of flexibility. Some people need more structure, but it sounds like you're kind of flourishing in it, even in the midst of some remaining uncertainty. So I'm excited for you and anticipate what comes next.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the other thing I really hear in there, and you're giving us sort of broad brushstrokes. So if I'm not interpreting it right, then you can tell
Mm-hmm.
me. But like one of the things that Lisa and I have talked about over and over is that people, when there's almost never that someone comes to us and like needs help that
Mm-hmm.
hasn't gotten outside their headlights.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We talk about this navigational skill of staying in your headlights. And
Yeah.
there's even a quote in the book that's basically like, if you're driving at dark and even in the fog,
Mm-hmm.
you can only see what your headlights can give you, but you actually can make a whole journey that way. And I hear you doing that.
Yes.
I hear you saying, okay, I took this step and this step. And now you're like looking back 2 or 3 years and saying, and even in this book, you were like, wait a minute, I've done that. Wait a minute.
Yeah.
I did
Right.
those like 5 steps.
Right.
And so to me, I'm like, oh, that's just like, that is counterintuitive to stay in your headlights, to sort of take it slow, to let it unfold, to let it come to you. Like Lisa, ironically or not, I was talking with another pastor today that was telling me just a really similar story.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, what are you doing? He's like, I'm just trying to like rest. I don't know what to do. I'm like, just so I hear like aspects of rest in your story too. So like Lisa, I'm like, oh, I'm really sorry that happened. And I do. I'm like, oh yeah, your story is certainly touching on a lot of the themes that we're bringing up here.
Yeah. In fact, it might have been in that chapter on stay in your headlights that the light went on for me. I'm like, oh wait, this is me.
Yeah.
100%. That's what I'm still doing that. I'm just like, I know where I'll be for the next year, and and we'll see what happens after that. One of the things that this kind of experience does is it really builds resilience. Like it's gotten me to a place where I'm like, if I lose another job, I'll figure it out. I figured it out once before. I'll figure it out again. I don't anticipate losing another job, but but I mean, if something were to fall through or whatever, it's all figure outable. Which is one of the things you talk about is figuring out the unfigure outable, right?
Embracing it,
embracing it,
figure it out.
That's right. Embracing it, not figuring it out because it's unfigure outable, but embracing the unfigure outable, which I love. Maybe just say something about that since that came up just now.
Yeah. So the moment I had one today. I was on the phone with a team I'm working with, actually a church team, and they're preparing to step into some very significant change in a church that has been around for a while and has lots of ingrained habits. Yeah, I'm sure you don't know any churches like that, Marcus or Michaela, but and they, the pastor said to me at one point, he said, I just don't think we know what to do, and I'm like, perfect. You're in the perfect place. Now you can move into exploring and taking some of those steps and trying some of those experiments and seeing what emerges and pay attention to it. And you may have an idea of where you're headed, but if you can release that outcome as a bullseye target and see what happens over time as you move towards it and make course corrections, 2 or 3 years from now, your world could look very different. And the life of this little group of churches could look very different. And it's all because you've attended to what God's doing in your midst, not trying to follow your own architected plan. It's my favorite moment with a person or a team is when someone just throws up their hands and says, I don't know what to do. Like perfect. And that's adaptive, right? That's the, we talk in the book about, becoming very skilled problem solvers. Most leaders are skilled in developing problem solving capacity, but there's a time when problem solving simply doesn't work. And you have to make the shift out of problem solving into curiosity. And that's the, I don't know moment. And not everything can be figured out. Michaela, I'm sure you have much more brilliance to add to that.
The only thing, and we don't need to tack on a lot here, is I also just think it's worth saying that even in the unfigureoutable, you're often not looking for one singular way.
Right.
There's a lot. I mean, and it's just like, well, in a world of ambiguity, there's sometimes it feels like there's 0 ways out. Sometimes
Yeah.
leaning into the fog, there's 4 or 5 ways that emerge, and then
Yeah.
doing the work to sort of figure out how you're going to stay in your headlights as
Right.
just as you've modeled, Marcus,
Right.
as you experiment your way forward. I just think that's worth saying, because it's not a switch where all of a sudden,
Yeah.
okay, we have clarity, let's go. You're just moving in ambiguity and making choices despite that, and carrying with you the discomfort of not having it be black and white.
Yeah. I think the thing that does become clear, or at least it did for me, was my identity, right? So everything around me is always somewhat fuzzy. Sometimes it's clear, sometimes it's a lot more foggy. But this experience gave me clarity in terms of who I am, right? I'm God's beloved, and there are certain things that I'm good at and that I'm passionate about, and so I appreciated the part where you talked about getting clear on what's mine to do, right? And I found that I got much better after all this at saying no to some things, And so let's close with this. Maybe just kind of as we move towards or navigate this life in flux, getting clear on what is mine to do and what's not, and why is that important? And and any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I'll jump in this time. This is my husband's favorite one in the book. He just says that question, that's the question. And well, again, a lot of this is based on how we're wired. Lisa and I did this sort of companion piece that for those people who are into or interested in the Enneagram, it's all about navigating change with the Enneagram. I think some of that comes up here, but it's just, especially in leadership, especially when the to-do lists get long, especially when the days feel short, there's just a lot to do. And one of the things that Lisa and I do in the book is that we signal what the common posture is, and kind of how most of us, pointing to myself here, when we're just going on hyperdrive, how we respond, and then the uncommon posture that signals, actually, you've done some of this deeper work. And the common posture here is, okay, I can play many roles. I'm here to do all the things that need to be done. And the uncommon posture is, goodness, I am wired uniquely. And I'm not saying that I'm not going to help or be part of a team, but there's really only certain things that I am best situated to do. And it changes it from, what does everybody want from me to what do I want for me? And that shift right there, that's like a shift happens in the book at that point. So that's a big one.
Yeah. Lisa, anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, one of your questions was around this, and speaking particularly to pastors and churches, which I know is the audience of CLI, and I've worked with a lot of pastors over the years. And I think pastors, particularly for a lot of reasons, have an extremely difficult job. And the biggest reason, I think, not the only reason certainly, but one of the biggest reasons is that every person walking through the door of a church has a set of expectations for their pastor, and that makes the pastor liable in their minds to be the thing they need the pastor to be. And then you get into church polity and leadership, and they have a whole nother set of expectations for the pastor, which are usually, short of the second coming of Jesus Christ, not realistic for any one human to inhabit. And the work I've done with pastors and then with their leadership teams is to help everyone understand you have a human being here who has got gifts and talents and capabilities and a spiritual call to this role. And they also have limitations. So they can't be all things. And we have to give them permission not to be all things and to stay, in their headlights, to live within the constraint of who God made them to be. And then figure out how to, if we're trying to do all this ministry and we don't have the right people, then maybe some of the ministry has to stop until we get the right people involved. We can't just, try and shore up, and keep doing more and more and more, which seems to be a pattern in a lot of churches. And I think for pastors, the biggest message I would send to them is get really clear on who you are and who you're not. And to your point, learn to say no.
Yeah.
And no
Yeah.
period is a complete sentence, right? Like you're done.
Yeah.
You don't have
That's
to
right.
give explanations. You don't have to justify or rationalize.
Yeah.
And get to know who you are and make sure you're communicating that to the
Yeah.
people around you to say, hey, that's not in my wheelhouse. It's a great idea.
Yeah.
But if we're going to do it, we're going to need to find the right people to do it. I
Yeah.
think pastors get so caught up in the expectations. And I think it's gotten worse since COVID,
Yeah.
right? Because now they're supposed to be politicians and, understand
Right.
the political landscape and understand the social landscape. And it's just it's an unfair and unwieldy set of expectations to live under. And I don't want to see pastors burn out, and it's happening all over the place.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this book is a great resource for navigating those very challenging times. And so, so I'll commend it to all of our listeners.
Thank you.
It's a great book, for navigating your own personal changes, but it also gives you resources for or thinking then in terms of your organization, because they're similar, right? They're similar.
Right.
It's about building adaptive capacity. And so anyway, thank you to both of you for writing this book, and thank you to both of you for being here. Real quick, if folks wanted to find out more about you and the work that you're doing, where could they go? Lisa, why don't you go first?
For me, we do have a website up for the book. It's lifeinflux.co, and it has links to download the Enneagram Guide, which Michaela mentioned. It also has links to both my organization's website, tomeanpartners.com, and to the Dupree Center. And obviously, tomeanpartners.com is my business website.
Awesome. And Michaela?
Yeah, for me, the same thing as Lisa said, except for you will not find me at To Mean Partners. You'll find me at Dupree.org, DEPREE.org. I'm also on LinkedIn. I love connecting with folks there. So feel free to hit me up. And Lisa too.
Awesome. Well, thank you for this great conversation. Thanks to both of you for the good work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus, for having us.